I have given you today, thanks to kind of the History of Form essay, which some of you have read already. It's a hard read by Adorno, I was pleased to see the essay. I didn't know about it until last year, because in its complex way, it's saying much of what I was trying to get across here, makes you realize that the field is wide open. I mean, what is an essay? And he inserts it into a tradition and into the contemporary state of art and politics in Germany and, in a sense, in the Western world. So I think it comes as a bit of a shock. I don't know about your education. I know everybody has a very different thing going on, but say what I teach, and I get these students that come through very, 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 very good high schools. They basically taught how to write, and writing is enormously important in the undergraduate program as well. And you realise that there's a lot of discipline and rules about what's considered a good essay, what's considered a bad essay, how to go about writing, and so forth and so on. There's a whole series of subcultures, and Adorno opens that up and says, hey, what's going on here? We're actually dealing with a form that doesn't know what it's doing. We're dealing with, as I said, there's a lot of openness and possibilities that you can pursue. That's why I was intrigued by that. So you might want to glance at that every now and again. We'll bring it up for discussion. I hope you don't mind me. It seems to me it's pretty self-centered the way I'm going about things. Like this could go a lot longer. But basically, ideas I've had the past few decades on things, this and that, and for me, it's really interesting trying to spin them out and make it into a sort of manageable or coherent whole that I think is important and I think would be helpful. We could pick an idea out of something in the text and work with it, but I thought this is a good way to get an interesting week discussion going. Other things that I mentioned here, I hadn't talked about my thesis. I talked a little bit about diary. I've got a lot more to say about that, a lot more, in relationship to the state of emergency and so on, in relationship to finished, polished texts, the place of drawings and diaries and so forth. We haven't talked at all, and I was talking with Kim, where she's in the blue, over a coffee break, about, the discussion actually became the place of sacrifice, violence and eroticism. What's the end of the sentence? I don't know. And using the work of Bataille, who a lot of people find very fascinating, tough, enigmatic. I put in one of his key concepts here, this French word, dépense. Someone speaks French here, right? I know there's a couple of us speaking. Yeah, Nina. Yeah. So dépense means what? What is the word? It's no big deal. You can't just gesture. We've already talked about gestures. Anglo-Saxon girl, you don't gesture. It all comes out of the mouth. Expense, expenditure. Okay. Waste, burn up, living the life in the fast lane. Do something for the heck of it. Ends are what count. Forget that means any calculation. That's what he's always talking about, and it's impossible to describe, actually. That's why it's part of why he's writing is so difficult. But we'll talk about, we'll get on to talk about Bataille in relationship to all this stuff a little later on. And the importance of sacrifice, the concept of sacrifice, the facts of sacrifice in relationship to modern states, as well as to so-called primitive ritual. You know, you can just go the whole gambit. It's Richard, right?
Yes.
He's talking about the Foucault notion of the diffusion of responsibility from any particular person to something like a machine or a system or a state, a judicial system first off. But the place of sacrifice, of capital punishment, for example, or incarceration even, in a modern state, it's as if the images of sacrifice that you may have from Hollywood versions of say, healing and initiation in non-Western culture have a place to play in the bosom of the modern state as well. It's a word which carries a lot of freight. Sacrifice. 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 It means to, in English anyway, it comes from the Latin, I guess, to make sacred. To make the sacred. Sacred, sacrifice, from facet or whatever. How do you make something sacred? You know, just ask yourself that question. It's impossibly difficult, fascinating question. And Bataille's, one of his epithets on that are a sacrifice consecrates that which it destroys, which is very scary. Sacrifice is different to so many other ritual actions in that there has to be destruction. And start spinning your wheels after that. It's incredibly absorbing, and I think it is his major interest through the 30 or 40 years of his life. It is also so important, I believe, for his notion of general economy as opposed to restricted economy. And the sort of economy that you and I talk about, not necessarily capitalist economy, but largely influenced by our everyday and maybe formal experience of the free market and so on and so forth, as it we're used to. He calls that restricted economy. And general economy for him is a much, much broader topic, which would be centered actually on sacrifice, or sacrificial notions of thinking about economy. And he wrote a book called Les Cursed Chair, La Patte Maudite, which is based on that. So he's a sort of economist as well as a revolutionary, a radical or eccentric economist, as well as a pornographer and a early days he was a surrealist and so on and so forth. So I wanted to bring him in a little bit. I wanted to talk about magic. We'll do this tomorrow maybe in relationship to questions. One of the things that you'll see in the Cornwall is I have an unquenchable interest in place of magic in artwork, and including writing, including critical writing, not just fiction. This sort of writing. And you can weigh that and think if there's anything, what am I getting at, and is there anything really solid there or not? And when I call this essay apotropaic, writing apotropaic texts, I think you'll learn a lot about where I'm coming from in this short, my project, this project, what is this, my project, writing apotropaic texts. Apotropaic, anybody on board with that term? It's a fancy term. It sounds okay.
Symbols to ward off evil of some sort?
Sorry, say again?
Are they symbols to ward off evil of some sort?
Symbols to ward off evil. What's your name?
Greg.
Greg?
Yeah.
And that was Zoe.
Zoya.
Last question before I break. Yeah, apotropaic. It's a term you use magic to defend yourself against magic.
Can you explain what you mean by magic?
Huh?
Can you explain what you mean by magic?
No. Okay. Magic is not science. I've often thought, the way to get out of that is to say, well, look, in the modern West, once science had sort of carved out its niche, magic became all the bad stuff, the stuff that science was against. It was the stuff that fell off the table. So it becomes all like fine. Magic is this like dog other. That's one way of thinking about it. I thought of sympathetic magic. I can talk a little bit about that, which is what Greg was getting at, I think, which is the image makers would be very interested in that here, which is the use of an image to change what the image is an image of. And the well-known examples there where someone is like having a fight with their girlfriend or boyfriend and they rip up the photograph, or they do something much worse with it. And it's interesting to me, by the way, why always an aggressive action is the one that comes as the first example, scary aggressive example. The image can be a fairly realistic image, as with a photograph, or it could be the merest sign, like a knot in grass, or a crudely made clay image. You know, it doesn't have to be exactly point for point. And for reasons we could go into this later, that is sometimes called homeopathic branch of sympathetic magic. I know it's ridiculous. And there's another form of magic associated with that, which is what Horkheimer and Adorno in their book on dialectic and enlightenment, and these serious philosophers, they pick up on that image magic, they're fascinated by it. And the other thing that's twisted around it is the use of a physical, something physical that's close to the person or where they live or something like that, that you cast a spell on or burn or, you know, do something horrible with, like the person's underclothing or fingernails or hair. You must have heard of these examples a zillion times. Something that's intimate, physically in touch with the body of that person, or as I said, their house or their lifestyle or something like that. And frequently the two are found together in magical practices. I'm interested in applying that to writing itself and how that can be done. And you'll read here, you get a bit of a taste for that. I mean, magic is often defined in, you know, straightforward ways, which are not very exciting, like action at a distance, irrational. I'm interested in those terms, they're fine, you know, but well, it's a long discussion. I mean, you open up, you know, it's a disturbing discussion too, because you find yourself having to defend weird things, or maybe sound a little crazy. But you know, I don't know how many people here must have a way of talking about this. I mean, there's always something a little extra to what's going on, maybe. But at the same time, that one remains fairly. The first thing that happens when you talk to people who live in environments where magic is happening is that they're usually pretty cynical about magic, and they'll tell you it's a question of belief. So the implication is if you don't believe in it, you know, you're not going to be affected. And second, the difference between magic to do evil and magic to do good. I've heard people say they don't believe in good magic, like winning the lottery or something, but they do believe very much in magic to harm. I had two friends who we had a long discussion about that in Colombia once. What do you do when you're dying? You know, I mean, how many people go visit a shaman you know, because nothing else is working? That's another aspect where magic seems to come to be very, very important, even in a rational, secular world. Magic as opposed to religion is another way of talking about it. That's Weber and all those guys. They have an evolutionary view. Fraser, who was a great armchair grandfather of anthropology, you know, they had these evolutionary views. At first there was this, second there was that, third there was that. There's this grand march of time through Western history. And magic belongs to older, primitive, quote-unquote, form of religion. But then churches, priests take control. and they run the magicians out of town, and they end up, hiding out in caves, or little old ladies who are going to get caught in the 17th century and could call witches and burned at the stake and that sort of stuff. Has anybody ever seen that article by, I loved it, by Sylvia Bovenschen, German, who wrote a book called, wrote an article called The Real Witch, the Fantastic Witch, the Something Else Witch, and she was interested in why witchcraft became important in feminism in Europe, Western Europe, in the 70s. And she had a fascinating article whereby she tried to do a Frankfurt School analysis of why there should be a sudden surge of interest amongst feminists in our time, in the 70s. As though the beliefs in witches dies away and then can come back at a certain time of crisis. And she was talking about huge protest in Rome against the anti-abortion policies of the Vatican, and suddenly this cry goes up: "We are the witches have returned." And she uses that as the beginning of her long essay, which is, well, how can we explain this? So it's something that won't go away and is interesting, and I'm interested in it, in particular in terms of how writing has impact, how images have impact. What about you? And what's your name?
Laura.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Got you here.
Well, I was just wondering because it's, there's so many associations with that word, and but I don't know what I think it means.
Well, it's so commodified and made hokey too, right? Like American Dream, or sheer magic. I mean, when you've run out of words to say something special about something special, there's always the word magic, and most of the time we accept it. So that's a good place to inquire. What is it about the use at that particular moment that seems to ring true?
Right. It's a word that either invokes understanding of something that's beyond language or words, but also automatic disbelief. I don't know. So,
Well, it would be great. This little discussion would be great for talking about the Commonwealth.
It just made me think, especially I was thinking of magic as in terms of belief, and wondering if you think it's possible that we'll, just with the way that we think in the Western world, whether it's possible to ever regain that. And I was thinking especially of Norman O'Brown, where he's talking in Phi Beta Kappa speech, and he's talking about rediscovering magic and rediscovering mystery, and especially his example of in the Himalayan hills, one of the things they teach at the university is internal heat. And and so basically they're judged by, they're put out on this frozen lake and they have these wet shirts, and they're judged on how many are dry by the end of the night. And he says,
I don't get it.
They have to create internal heat.
Oh, right. Okay.
So it's something that seems incredibly impossible, But he says, but the outcome is completely objective. I mean, you know if the shirt's dry or not. And then his point was that that the Western mind wasn't. We don't even consider this type of magic a possibility. So therefore, it's not possible for us until we have that mindset.
Could you get that speech for that talk?
I have it in a book. Yeah, but it's a Phi Beta Kappa speech. It was at Colombia, right? In 1960.
Pretty amazing.
Yeah.
It's great. It's
especially at that time.
yeah.
Do you think you could download it for us and we get a copy?
Yeah. Find it.
Yeah, he's fascinating.
I mean, I think there's mentioned.
And so gutsy and so learned.
Yeah.
See, when he writes, actually he's got a fantastic essay on bataille that he wrote about mid-1990s. 1990. Yeah, Dionysus 1990, something like that. Is that the title?
I think it's Dionysus 2000.
See, Or 2000,
Yes,
okay,
I'm
yeah.
sorry.
No, but it wasn't 2000, it was like Block of Logan at the end of the essay, I think it's 1990.
Yeah, but the essay's called that.
How did you go to it?
It's Norman Brown.
I think it was on your list of things. I think
Oh, great, you guys are so wonderful.
it was on your list of things.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of his. He was such a funny, cantankerous character. But I wanted to say, is, in terms of form of writing, the Fictocriticism, that essay, Dionysus 2000, that is exquisite. The way he works as a poet, with poetry, and revolutionary impulses and theory, and he's so caustic and so clear.
But even in the other one, he's provoking their style of writing because he's talking about rediscovering mystery, and he says this is the kind of stuff, this is the kind of writing that won't lead you a Phi Beta Kappa key.
Yeah.
And he's talking to the, I mean, it's a speech for the for that purpose.
So let's see if we could get a copy. Have you got the book here? Didn't bring it. Well, either of those essays would be a lot of fun to look at.
Yeah, because the first one's short.
Hmm?
Too. It's like 7 pages. So it's short. The other one.
Norman
Chernobyl.
O. Period Brown.
Say that again.
It's like Genesis P. Origins. Norman O. Period Brown. And the speech is.
I think that one's called like Apocalypse or something. And that's the book, but I think the
Can you
first
guys
one
get
is
in touch and work on that? What's your name?
Hamlin.
Hannah?
Hamlin. Hamlin.
Never heard Hannah.
Yeah.
And what are you interested in?
I don't know. Yeah, that'd be a beautiful example of the sort of writing I'm interested in. And there was a character. I mean, his father was in the oil business in Texas. He was a student of classics. He went to Oxford and did the classics thing, and then he wanted to be a Marxist classicist. So he studied under I think the one Marxist classicist in the US, who was at Wisconsin, and he wrote on Hermes. And I think the book is called Hermes the Thief. It's a sort of budding first capitalist figure, Hermes. And then he became a socialist, Marxist in the 40s, and then he became deeply into Freud. And he wrote this book called Life Against Death, which is all about shit and the anus and the relationship of that to money. It's a mind-blowing book. I know it sounds sort of both nasty and sounds like some simple-minded Freudianism. I thought the book was incredible. I only read it the other day, and he uses a lot of Jonathan Swift, the Irish wit, the skeptic who wrote Gulliver's Travel, and the chapter on on Swift is fantastic. And he just opens up this completely different way of thinking about reality and world history through Swift and shitting. And you realise it's a bit like all my precious words about violence. It's very hard to write about those things because you seem like either a spoiled child or simple-minded Freudian, with the different stages. It's a turn on, I thought. And then he became a student of Islam. Last 20 years of his life, he was deeply into Islam. So you've got the Greek mythology, you've got the Marxism, you've got Islam, all in the one cantankerous guy. I heard that he used to teach Greek myths at Santa Cruz, and once he taped all his lectures, and he put the tape recorder up on the stage, and he sat down with all the students and listened to them, and then they would get up and criticize. It's very strange, very interesting character. And then you guys are all in love with French theory and stuff, so am I, don't get me wrong. But there are these guys who are right there in the United States, they're like, very clear English. You understand it straight away, very poetic, and they're completely ignored. And they're writing a long time before these guys in France get translated. But that's what Said called traveling theory. I mean, it comes from France or Germany or the Greenland. It's always going to seem
who is it and what was the book?
Sorry?
Who was it and what was the book?
What?
Who were you talking about? The name?
This guy, Norman O'Brien.
Oh, same guy. Oh,
Same
okay.
fellow. Yeah. I like the way you said we. So that's the other egg thing. I wanted to ask how many people here are called artists? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Sort of.
7, 8,
No.
9, 10, 11, 12. It's a big chunk. It's really fascinating. I had no idea. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about your current projects. So, yeah. I've done this, I told you done this initial answer before.
Now
Name?
using sound and architecture. And it's kind of
It's kind of
like it goes into many, but I'm interested in sound and its relationship to fluid architecture, so non-material architecture,
like,
like done through projections or light or vibrations.
so what do you call it architecture?
I studied, I'm interested in physics and mathematics.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going into studying particle physics, frequencies, oscillations, waves, and how that can manifest as architecture.
So it's like making space out of sound or structure. Space is such a big word.
I want to do real-time architecture. Real-time architecture is
And did you bring any stuff to it?
I have a book that I wrote.
Really? You got it? Wonderful. Why don't you bring it along? Have you got it?
Okay, yeah, I have.
Yeah. Big book?
But I studied a lot of esoteric, philosophy. It has a little bit of a lot of things: Islamic art, biomorphic art, numbers, that kind of stuff, quantum mechanics. All of that.
So I'd like to hear more. Take me out of my rut. Who's the next artist?
I went
Well,
to school. I went to school.
Are they?
Yeah. I did the school. I have master's also now. But I'm not too sure about the word artist anymore.
Yeah, who is?
This category is too confusing.
Let's talk a bit about that.
Yeah. The whole definition is just too dodgy.
But
It's like the word magic. You should be good at this, Laura. Okay. If you think magic is difficult, what about the word artist?
That's why I don't call myself an artist. I have a problem with the word.
Yeah. No, but we're sort of stuck with it, right?
Yeah.
For good or for bad.
It's a little
Huh?
fascist, like term.
Have you come up with an alternative?
Yeah, let's come up with a new one.
there are many, of course.
Actor.
I mean, I don't want to put any alternative right now as the alternative.
I like the way you've got your hand on the door. I can see the information, I can see the symbolism, but now I'm getting the third meaning.
I'm interested in network collaborations on streaming from something that could be magical, like instrumental transcommunication, so-called, like EVP, electromagnetic voice phenomenon, not so far from to noise, to satellite hacking, hijacking, sounds from the space, like geomagnetosphere, DLF.
So you two guys, tell us a bit about how sound has become a bit of a history of sound in the art world. I'm sure these things are very old, but in my experience, this is actually about 30, 40 years only become taken up in increasing frequencies, right? Hmm?
I mean, to me, it was based on an experience, which was a very esoteric experience. So that's how I got into it. I've never done sound. I know a lot of, I have a lot of musicians that's what's intriguing to me. I don't know about it.
Well, Zoya was asking me something about what I was reading, and in the kitchen just now, and I said Brian Geisen, some of his novels and stuff about him, and he seems to be one of these characters who was into sound in the 60s, maybe, from the 60s onwards, and no sooner had he invented cutups in this famous Beef Hotel in 1959, when Stanley knife went through the artwork and all these newspaper bits fell on the floor, and he moved them around and he started to laugh hysterically. And he told William Burroughs, who was in room 15, what he just discovered, and Burroughs went out of his mind with enthusiasm and produced 6,000 within about 3 years. That's a footnote. Geisen just moved straight on to tape recordings, and then putting inserts from one tape recording into another tape recording, and Burroughs is like following that as well, and they see this as having magical properties. They can divine and so forth. And in Cities of the Red Knight, which is part of the trilogy of Burroughs, the last 3 books he wrote, he has a detective called Clem Snide, who's brought in to solve a missing person case. The parents come in, and their beautiful young son has disappeared on a Greek island, and he's up to all sorts of weird antics. So Clem Snide goes over to the island, and he plays the water flushing in the toilet, the shower, the waves breaking on the beach, Greek TV, all intermingled, and then he switches on the TV and sits back and just listens to this medley of sounds, because he says that's the way to solve the case. I mean, and then the Geisen went on to start to do poetry with music, and now we have rap music, and there's an article in the New Yorker just this week with that traces the history of rap music to this particular rap artist from the 60s and 70s. I'm blanking on his name. He's been a crack addict now for like...
Oh, Grandmaster Flash.
Whom?
Grandmaster Flash, or Cool Herc,
No.
or...
Earlier. And he's been a crack addict for about 20 years.
Dolomite.
Oh, Sly.
Huh?
Sly.
No, it's a staggering article.
Gil Scott Heron.
Crack addicted musicians. Oh, Bootsy Collins. There's a lot to choose from.
I'll come out with it. But anyway, I was just thinking about, for our interest, my interest in using language and as a sound. Language is hovering between a sound and a meaning, combined with other sorts of sounds. Not necessarily musical instruments, but I just, in my own little life, I've come across more and more people working on sound in the last 2 or 3 years, and I just was wondering why it's become such a... Is it like a critique or a dissatisfaction or a boredom with visual?
I'm bored with the mimetic arts. I've been doing them. I feel, in the words of Bataille, there's an overabundance. And so I'm actually going with it in my shoes with physics, but not so much with sound as string theory, multiverse existence. The idea that the essence is basically subatomic, that it's oscillation, it's vibration, and those are the creative forces of the universe.
Wow. So there's 3 sound people already.
Well, I might not be in the same group. Because
I'm sure not. Yes. It's really very different things that are not here. Yeah.
Because mimetic gets to be redundant, it's repetition, instead of creating
Copying
representation.
reality. No, keep going with the
Because
question.
Plato considered it a degradation to do that. You didn't get your truth. And for the longest time, we gave in the school that Aristotle's idea that you find truth in mimetic arts. But now I'm going back to this idea of what kind of truth we've been living off of, looking for truth in mimetic art for how long, and still it's not there.
why these connections to sound so deep? this is the question I will have for you both, because you both are looking at this quantum physics and the Dark Hadron Collider kind of theories. And
M
then
theory is right hand.
the science connection in both of your research that you're talking about that is so strong, because the science that you're talking about is so such a big entity.
But you can be a bit harsh on the mimetic, right? I mean, you can be so creative within the mimetic. You know? I mean, it seems to me most of the world gets possessed by spirits. I think that. And it really is continuous how in the West it doesn't happen.
Yes, yeah.
And so, you know, you sometimes think, why do all those people get possessed? And then you think, well, the better question is, how come people in the West don't? And then you meet these people who say, oh, but they do, you know, they go to rock concerts and rave concerts and they become put into trance states and get all these sort of quasi-trance states around us in the West. There's some truth in that.
Yeah, but
I'm talking about real spirits.
I'm talking about, that would be to me the forces of the universe, to get into a trance from music or by, you know, the sounds and lights that are purer than.
I see. So we go into the trance and stuff.
Yes, trance would be there.
I mean, I'm not trying to say that ritual can be, most ritual I suppose is very conformist and has its rules and all that. In that sense, it's not going to be mind-blowingly creative, but it's set as in contrast to everyday life, and I was intrigued by that. In my book on mimesis, I was fascinated by filmmakers who film trance. I was thinking of Jean Rouge. Have you seen the film Les Maîtres Fous, the Foolish Masters, and I don't know the show to you because of the few. And then a film called Trojan Cricket. Yeah. Well, I'll describe those when we get onto the more mimetic things. But there, it seems to me, you've got a very fascinating, almost postmodern or modern thing going on. Where you've got a white filmmaker from Western Europe going to film dark-skinned people who are in trance, who are possessed by the spirits of white colonialists. You sort of following me? Yeah. And just in that circuit alone, there's a lot to think about. Trance in the physical body versus the copying on celluloid. There's definitely a parallel thing going on there. But when we see the activities that are being mimed by the people who are possessed, there's a lot of playing, there's a lot of theatre that is individually created at particular moments in time. So, I mean, it seems to me, I also saw this film, you may have seen it, directed by Jenny Livingston, called Paris is Burning, made in the early 90s, about black and Hispanic gay guys, mainly in the Bronx of New York, who dress up in women's clothing and have contests.
It's a great
It's really great. That may be where they have the balls. No longer. Probably a lot of those guys are dead from AIDS. I don't know. I think this. But when I saw that movie, I was very optimistic about, you know, all the talk about gender change and dress changing, transvestism, and people discovering this and that about themselves without necessarily changing, you know, those aspects of their so-called identity. And I basically hate identity politics. But I was thinking, you know, what here was my take in the back of the mimesis book saying, hey, guess what? Everybody's becoming something new. They're taking upon themselves another persona or various personae. And isn't that fun? So, you know, there's an example of the mimetic which I think is door opening.
Or Genesis Peorage. Genesis Peorage you mentioned before. And that also underwent transformations with her partner. They tried to get to the point where they mimicked each other, right?
She's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
I have a question. Where do you see that boundary between mimesis, representation, and condition?
Well, I consider arts have to be different from the actual human interaction. So mimetic arts are representing human condition, the representation, storytelling, painting, all that. And mimesis to me is the individual. If we have free will, it's because conforming to me is when we use conforming or that's coercion. You can condition yourself. You don't need coercion for that. You can condition yourself. But I think conforming is more of a pressure or coercion from the group to conform. Where many of us here are non-conformists, but there's also a time when these become creative and go beyond.
God, I like the way you said many. Not all.
I teach rhetoric and composition, so I don't use absolutes very often.
No, but to me, I mean, like, because to me, mimesis is.
I don't know, maybe just
No, it's not good. Or, I mean, to me, like, mimesis is directly related to conditioning, imitation. That's where it comes from. But I don't think that it's equal to, like what you were saying before of the visual arts, because I think that, representation to me that there is a displacement, so it's not mimetic in a way. The moment you take something and contextualize, I'm going off the dimension there, what's your difference?
Time's caught up with us pretty well, and there's still several artists I want to hear from, so maybe we'll call on you. When does we meet tomorrow, right?
Yeah.
I just wanted to say about this conditioning thing, and you have to make that distinction between life and its representation. But the trouble with that, of course, is it supposes that there is life without representation, that I'm not. I mean, I don't want to be cynical about it, but and your distinction is useful and important and necessary. But it does. You do get sort of worried then about how real is the real.
Yes, I'm exploring.
Yeah. I was looking. My friend Stephen Milkey, who is sort of my intellectual guide, he came up with a bunch of definitions of not definitions, but quotes he liked that pointed to Fictocriticism. And we had a friend, Greg Denning, who's just the most wonderful guy. He'd been a Jesuit priest, and he turned into a historian of the Pacific. Mr. Bly's Bad Language, a study of the revolt on the Bounty, the ship called the Bounty, islands and beaches, and Greg knew so much, and such a gentle person. And he was an oddball in the history department at University of Melbourne. And in the last 10 years or so of his life, he used to go around different venues and teach something like Fictocriticism. I forget what he called it, but this is what Stephen quoted him saying or writing. All my academic life, I taught history by first requiring my students to transcribe some event or ritual or drama in their lives into narrative. I call this ethnography, which is what this stuff emerges as. All right. They soon discovered how difficult that was to do. They learned that there was nothing that they observed that was the subject of some reflective discourse by somebody else. We're all slaves of this. Knowing what that discourse was, and I think that's probably why a lot of us are so interested in theory. It's not so much to imitate the theory, but to know to what degree you're being, not necessarily programmed, but influenced by prior thought, right? They learned that there was nothing that they observed that was the subject of some reflective discourse by somebody else. Knowing what that discourse was, what questions shaped it, and in what way their own ethnography added to it, was to be the cultural persons they needed to be to really write history. So maybe it sounded a bit like a sermon, but maybe end on that point and meet tomorrow and discuss the